The storm that saved Japan, was it divine intervention or pure luck? In the late 13th century, the most feared military force on earth set its sights on the islands of Japan. Led by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire launched not one, but two massive invasions, determined to bring Japan under its rule. But both attempts ended in catastrophe, thanks, legend says, to the kamikaze, or divine wind, a typhoon that destroyed the Mongol fleets. For centuries, the story has lived on as a tale of fate and protection from the gods. But what really happened? Was it nature, strategy, or something far more human that shaped the outcome? The real story behind the Mongol invasion of Japan. Where it all started, born in 1215, Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he inherited both the Mongol appetite for conquest and a more refined political vision. While earlier Mongols were nomadic warriors, Kublai leaned into ruling, not just raiding. After a brutal civil war with his own relatives, he became Great Khan in 1260 and soon founded the Yuan Dynasty in China, the first foreign dynasty to rule all of China. Kublai wasn't just about war. He was fascinated by Chinese culture, Buddhism, and governance. He employed scholars, engineers, and even foreign advisors like Marco Polo, who later described his court in awe. But despite his reforms and tolerance, Kublai was still a Mongol. Expansion was in his blood. After consolidating power across vast swaths of Asia, he turned his attention eastward. Japan, an isolated yet culturally rich island nation, had remained outside Mongol influence. But to Kublai, Japan's refusal to submit was both an insult and a strategic challenge. In 1266, he sent his first diplomatic message demanding that Japan become a tributary state of the Mongol Empire. The Japanese shogunate, particularly the Kamakura government, ignored it. Over the next few years, Kublai sent multiple envoys, all of whom were rejected or ignored. To a Mongol emperor, that wasn't just defiance, it was war. By 1274, the Mongols were ready. With troops drawn from China and Korea, they launched their first invasion, marking the beginning of one of the most audacious and ill-fated military campaigns in East Asian history. In October 1274, Kublai Khan launched his invasion from Koryo. The fleet consisted of about 300 ships, carrying roughly 15,000 troops, a mix of Mongol Chinese and Korean conscripts. This force was relatively small compared to the second invasion, but it was enough to terrify Japan. The Mongols first hit the smaller islands between Korea and Japan, Tsushima and Iki. These islands had small garrisons of samurai who were slaughtered in brutal fashion. Villages were burned, civilians massacred. The Mongols used gunpowder bombs, likely early Chinese thunder crash bombs, causing confusion and terror, which was possibly the first use of explosives in Japanese warfare. The Mongols weren't just savage, they were organized, well-equipped, and terrifyingly modern. They used gunpowder bombs, coordinated infantry, and psychological warfare. Japanese defenders, mainly samurai used to one-on-one duels, were stunned by Mongol tactics, volleys of arrows, shield walls, and mass charges. During the Mongol invasion of Japan in 1274, several key figures played pivotal roles on both sides of the conflict. On the Mongol side, command was largely top-down and highly logistical, less about individual heroics and more about coordination. One of the main commanders was Liu Fuxiang, a Chinese general serving under the Yuan Dynasty. He was responsible for leading a massive multi-ethnic force composed of Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and Korean conscripts. Alongside him was Hongdagu, a Korean official and military leader from Goryeo, which had become a vassal state of the Mongol Empire. Under Mongol pressure, Goryeo had to provide ships, soldiers, and support for the invasion, making Hongdagu's involvement both politically and militarily critical. On the Japanese side, resistance was led by prominent samurai leaders defending their homeland. Shoni Kagesuke, a powerful lord from Kyushu, commanded the initial defense at Hakata Bay, where the Mongols first landed. His forces were among the first to engage in combat, and they fought valiantly despite being outmatched by Mongol tactics. Another notable figure was Takazaki Suenaga, a samurai who not only fought in the invasion, but ensured his deeds were remembered by commissioning the Moko Shurai Ekotoba, an illustrated scroll depicting his exploits. Thanks to this unique first-hand account, historians today have rare visual insight into how the samurai looked, fought, and viewed their role during one of Japan's most legendary military crises. By November 19th, 1274, the Mongol fleet reached Hakata Bay, near present-day Fukuoka. The area was defended by local samurai under commanders like Shoni Kagesuke. The Japanese had expected a seaborne attack and had constructed basic defensive walls along the shore, but they were thinly manned. When the Mongols landed, they came in mass formations, not in dueling pairs. Their soldiers beat drums, shouted war cries, and launched coordinated arrow barrages. The samurai, trained for individual combat, were shocked. They expected one-on-one duels. Instead, they were facing disciplined, fast-moving units using composite bows, round shields, and tight formations. The Japanese defenders fought back fiercely, but with no central army or unified command, they were outnumbered and out-organized. Skirmishes raged through the day. Some samurai, like Takazaki Suenaga, managed to rally and counterattack, but Japanese forces couldn't gain momentum. It was clear the Mongols had the tactical edge. And then, nature stepped in. A sudden storm, some say a typhoon, slammed into the Mongol fleet. With no deep harbors and their ships anchored offshore, the invaders were caught off guard. The fleet, not well built for stormy waters, was smashed by wind and waves. Korean records suggest hundreds of ships were lost and many troops drowned. Reeling from the unexpected damage and with no permanent beachhead established, the remaining Mongol commanders called a retreat. The fleet limped back to the Korean peninsula. Kublai Khan's first attempt to conquer Japan had ended, not with defeat in battle, but with a divine wind and a shattered navy. It wasn't a decisive military victory for Japan, but it was enough. The first invasion had failed, and back in China, Kublai Khan was already plotting a second, far more massive attempt. The Second Invasion. After the humiliating failure of the 1274 invasion, Kublai Khan, emperor of the Yuan dynasty and grandson of Genghis Khan, was furious. In Mongol culture, defiance had to be crushed swiftly and decisively. And Japan's resistance, coupled with the storm that devastated his fleet, was a serious blow to his authority. For 7 years, Kublai threw the weight of his empire into planning an invasion that would not just succeed, it would obliterate Japanese resistance and permanently bring the islands into the Mongol fold. Kublai's plan was unprecedented in scale. He called for a dual-pronged assault which would converge on Kyushu from 2 directions. The campaign was meticulously planned, but ultimately undermined by geography, coordination failures, and nature itself. The Eastern Route Army, comprising approximately 40,000 troops, departed from Yugioh. This force was made up primarily of Mongol and Korean soldiers, with the inclusion of some northern Chinese units. It was likely commanded by Hong Dagu, a Korean official loyal to the Yuan dynasty who had played a significant role in the earlier 1274 campaign. Another Korean commander, Kim Bang-gyeong, may have contributed behind the scenes, especially in the logistical organization of shipbuilding and naval deployment. The Eastern Army's task was to act as the vanguard, landing first near Hakata Bay in June 1281 to secure a foothold and hold position until the arrival of the larger Southern Army. The Southern Route Army was the true hammer of Kublai Khan's plan. An enormous force of around 100,000 men launched from southern China, likely from ports in Fujian and Zhejiang. This army was notably more diverse, consisting of Han Chinese, Southern Mongols, and Central Asian and Muslim conscripts drawn from across the vast Mongol Empire. Leadership of this force fell to generals such as Fan Wenhu and Zhang Guanghan, though sources indicate that coordination between land and naval commanders was fragmented, leading to a lack of cohesion that would ultimately contribute to the campaign's failure. The Southern Army carried the majority of the siege weapons, supplies, and heavy infrastructure necessary for sustained combat. They were meant to break Japan once the Eastern Army softened its defenses. Supporting these two armies was a fleet of staggering proportions. More than 4,000 ships hastily constructed across Korean and Chinese shipyards. This floating armada included large troop transports, supply ships, flat-bottomed barges better suited to inland waters than the open sea, and a smaller number of purpose-built warships. Many vessels, rushed through production to meet deadlines, were poorly designed for oceanic storms and lacked the durability needed for a prolonged campaign across treacherous waters. Kublai wasn't just seeking military victory, he wanted to punish and absorb Japan. He had already integrated Korea, Tibet, Yunnan, and most of China. To him, Japan was a small, defiant outlier, and its refusal to become a tributary state was an insult to Yuan legitimacy. This campaign was also symbolic, a demonstration of the invincibility of the Mongol world order. But despite the grandeur of the plan, cracks were forming. The logistics were shaky as they coordinated two massive fleets from different countries across thousands of miles without reliable communication. The language barriers, the difference in naval traditions, and the forced conscription of unwilling troops, particularly Koreans and Chinese, meant morale was uneven and unity was fragile. On the Japanese side, the Kamakura shogunate had spent those 7 years fortifying. They knew the Mongols were coming. Massive stone seawalls had been built to prevent landings. Local samurai militias were placed on alert and practiced night raids, coastal defense, and coordinated counterattacks. Japan was far more strategically organized than in 1274. So when the two Mongol armies finally converged off the coast of Kyushu, Japan was not only ready, it was waiting. One of the most effective new tactics was the use of nighttime raids by small bands of samurai in lightweight boats. Instead of waiting for the enemy to land, Japanese warriors took the fight to the anchored Mongol fleet. These attacks were typically carried out under the cover of darkness. samurai would sneak up on Mongol ships in small, fast vessels, board them silently and engage in close combat, killing as many as possible before slipping away. The psychological impact was huge. The Mongol troops, many of whom slept aboard ships, were never able to rest, always fearing sudden death from the sea. These raids disrupted coordination, sapped morale, and created constant fear in the ranks. The Japanese also developed a form of early naval sabotage, using burning boats to attack the tightly packed Mongol fleet. Small, wooden ships were loaded with flammable materials, then set on fire and sent drifting toward Mongol vessels. With so many ships anchored close together, a single flaming boat could cause chain reactions, burning multiple vessels in one strike. These tactics were especially effective in narrow bays and inlets where maneuverability was limited. The Mongols, unfamiliar with such tactics, struggled to defend against them, and chaos often broke out as ships crashed into each other while trying to escape the flames. Perhaps the boldest move was Japan's decision to attack the Mongol fleet before it ever landed. Using small, nimble vessels, Japanese fighters would approach the Mongol ships from different angles and launch arrows or board them directly. They focused on supply ships and command vessels, trying to cripple the Mongols' ability to organize or feed their troops. These tactics effectively turned the sea itself into a battlefield, something the Mongols hadn't prepared for. They had expected to fight a ground war. Instead, they were facing a guerrilla naval campaign. These tactics worked because they played to Japan's strengths. The defenders knew their coastline, the tides, the currents, the hidden inlets, like the back of their hand. Their boats were small and quick, built for speed and surprise, perfect for slipping in, striking hard, and vanishing before the enemy could react. And more than anything, it came down to spirit. The samurai weren't just skilled, they were fearless. Many threw themselves into these raids, knowing they might not come back, not to win the war outright, but to shake the enemy, slow them down, and keep Japan standing just a little longer. In early June 1281, the Eastern Route Army arrived off the coast of Hakata Bay, Kyushu. However, instead of launching an immediate invasion like they had in 1274, this time they were ordered to wait for the much larger Southern Route Army, which was delayed. The Eastern Army anchored its fleet offshore, likely due to a combination of unclear orders and uncertainty about how to proceed without the main force. This gave the Japanese exactly what they needed: time. While the Mongol fleet sat anchored in the bay, the Japanese didn't wait. Small bands of samurai in fast boats launched night raids, slipping silently through the dark, boarding enemy ships, setting them on fire, and vanishing back into the night. The Mongols had no answer for it. Their men were worn down, restless, unable to sleep, constantly on edge. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. By late July, the Southern Route Army, with over 100,000 troops and a massive logistics train, finally arrived from ports in Fujian and Zhejiang. The plan was to combine forces and make a coordinated attack. But this didn't go smoothly. The two fleets failed to effectively unify their command structures. The Southern Army was exhausted after weeks at sea and poorly acclimated to the waters off Kyushu. They tried to coordinate a landing, but Japanese resistance was fierce, especially near Imari Bay and Taka Island. In one battle, Mongol forces did manage to land in Imari and Iki Island, but Japanese samurai quickly mobilized and repelled them. Japanese defenders often used localized counterattacks, leveraging terrain knowledge and swift cavalry charges once the Mongols were on land. Still, the Mongol forces were massive, and had they broken through the Japanese lines and established a solid beachhead, the campaign might have turned. The Kamikaze, Typhoon of 1281, the divine wind that saved Japan. The typhoon struck in early August 1281, most likely between August 12th and 15th. The Southern Route Army had only just arrived and joined the Eastern Route Army off the coast of northern Kyushu, particularly in the waters near Hakata Bay, Imari Bay, and the Goto Islands. At the time, the Mongols were preparing for a full-scale coordinated landing. While some landing attempts had been made, they were scattered and mostly repelled by Japanese forces. The majority of the Mongol troops, especially the Southern Army, were still aboard their ships waiting for the final push. And that's when the typhoon hit. Japanese sources refer to the storm as cataclysmic. 2 full days of torrential rain, hurricane-force winds, and massive waves. It's described in some accounts as a wall of wind and sea that came seemingly out of nowhere. Contemporary records like the Hachiman Gudokun and visual depictions in the Moko Shurai Ekotoba portray ships being lifted, smashed, and torn apart by the fury of the storm. Although we can't assign it a modern category, it was likely equivalent to a Category 4 or 5 typhoon, one strong enough to destroy wooden ships, drown thousands, and scatter fleets over hundreds of kilometers. Japanese sources refer to the storm as cataclysmic. 2 full days of torrential rain, hurricane-force winds, and massive waves. It's described in some accounts as a wall of wind and sea that came seemingly out of nowhere. Contemporary records like the Hachiman Gudokun and visual depictions in the Moko Shurai Ekotoba portray ships being lifted, smashed, and torn apart by the fury of the storm. Although we can't assign it a modern category, it was likely equivalent to a Category 4 or 5 typhoon, one strong enough to destroy wooden ships, drown thousands, and scatter fleets over hundreds of kilometers. Thousands of ships capsized or smashed into one another, caught in the violent winds and crashing waves. Troops and horses drowned by the tens of thousands, dragged down with the wreckage or swept away by the storm. Supply vessels carrying food, weapons, and siege equipment were obliterated, leaving the surviving forces stranded, starving, and disarmed. Those few who managed to reach the shore found no safety. They were cut down by waiting Japanese samurai or captured and executed without mercy. While the story of the kamikaze has long been rooted in legend, modern historians and archaeologists have confirmed that it was based on a very real and devastating natural event. Historical records from all sides, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, describe a powerful typhoon that struck the Mongol fleet in the summer of 1281. These sources agree on key details. The storm lasted for days, caused massive losses at sea, and effectively destroyed the invasion force. In recent decades, underwater archaeological teams have discovered compelling physical evidence of the destruction. Off the coasts of Kyushu and the Goto Islands, divers have uncovered the remains of Mongol ships, some buried under silt, others partially preserved on the seabed. Many of these wrecks still contain weapons, armor, and even human bones, frozen in time beneath the waves. The construction of the ships matches Yuan-era designs, and some vessels show signs of violent structural damage. Shattered hulls, splintered beams, consistent with sudden destruction from a major storm, not the slow decay of sunken ships over time. This archaeological evidence lines up closely with the written accounts from the 13th century and strongly supports the idea that a catastrophic typhoon directly caused the failure of the invasion. What was once seen as myth and a divine wind sent by the gods is now understood as a combination of military miscalculation and meteorological disaster, one that changed the course of East Asian history. Beyond the historical facts and battlefield strategies, the legend of the divine wind became steeped in phantasmagorical lore, spiritual symbolism, and deep cultural belief. For the people of medieval Japan, this wasn't just a storm. It was a cosmic message, a supernatural shield, proof that the gods themselves walked beside them. After the second Mongol invasion was annihilated by the 1281 typhoon, the Japanese people and the Kamakura shogunate framed it not as luck, but as divine intervention. The storm was said to have been summoned by the kami, the sacred spirits of Shinto, Japan's indigenous faith. Most credited the wind to Hachiman, the god of war and protector of Japan, who was believed to have unleashed the typhoon in response to prayers and offerings made by warriors and priests. Some versions of the legend tell of Shinto priests performing secret rituals at sacred shrines, calling upon the storm to protect the homeland. Others say that ancestral spirits of fallen samurai rose from the sea itself, forming the wind and rain that tore through the enemy fleet. The idea took hold that Japan was a Shinkoku, a land divinely protected, a place the gods would never allow to fall under foreign rule. Over time, the kamikaze storm took on eerie, supernatural qualities in local folklore. The wind was said to speak with the voices of the gods, howling like warriors, screaming into battle. Some coastal villagers claim to have seen ghostly samurai riding the waves, their armor glowing in lightning, wielding spectral swords against phantom enemies. There were stories of celestial dragons stirring in the clouds, or Tengu, a mythical warrior spirits with wings and long noses, whipping the winds into chaos to punish the invaders. In a few local legends, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, herself casts her gaze down in anger, ordering the heavens to unleash fury upon the defilers of her chosen land. These stories blurred the line between faith, fear, and folklore, and they weren't just entertainment. They reinforced national identity, reminding every generation that Japan was a sacred land, protected not just by armies, but by the elements and the divine. The kamikaze myth became a powerful symbol of resistance, purity, and divine favor. So much so that it resurfaced centuries later during World War II, when Japanese suicide pilots adopted the name kamikaze, believing they too were a final divine wind meant to protect the nation. But the original legend is older, stranger, and more spiritual. A ghost-ridden typhoon filled with wrathful gods, warrior ancestors, and celestial vengeance. A storm that didn't just sink ships, but spoke to the soul of Japan. Effect on Japanese identity and culture. For Japan, this wasn't just a victory. It became a foundational myth, a story that explained not just what happened, but who the Japanese were. The belief that Japan was a divinely protected land took root immediately after the invasion. The kamikaze, the divine wind, was seen as proof that the gods, particularly Hachiman, god of war, actively intervened to protect the nation. The Kamakura shogunate used this idea to legitimize its rule, portraying itself as the righteous defender of a holy land. Samurai culture was reinforced as not only militarily powerful but spiritually chosen. Their sacrifices weren't just heroic, they were sacred. Over time, this event became part of national memory, recorded in scrolls, painted in temples, and passed down through generations. The failure of the 1281 invasion was a major blow to Kublai Khan, both strategically and symbolically. He had invested immense resources into this campaign, years of planning, the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen, and troops drawn from across the empire, including reluctant Koreans, Han Chinese, Muslims, and Central Asians. The storm not only destroyed this force, it exposed the limits of Mongol power. Kublai was furious. He refused to accept defeat and ordered preparations for a third invasion, but the reality on the ground was stark. The yuan treasury was strained. Internal rebellions in southern China, Vietnam, and Burma were growing, and resentment among his conscripted allies, especially in Korea, was reaching a boiling point. The empire, once unstoppable, had overreached. Eventually, plans for a third invasion were quietly dropped. Japan remained unconquered, and Kublai Khan, for all his achievements, would never expand eastward again. The kamikaze is more than a storm. It's a national symbol, and its meaning has evolved over time, even into the modern era. During World War II, the term was revived and reframed in a tragic new light. Kamikaze pilots, who gave their lives crashing planes into enemy ships, were named after the divine wind that once saved Japan. The term became a powerful tool of propaganda, evoking ancient heroism and self-sacrifice. Today, the word kamikaze still carries deep emotional weight in Japan. It's tied to ideas of honor, resilience, sacrifice, and fate. The story is taught in schools, remembered in literature, art, and memorials. Not just as history, but as a reminder of a moment when Japan stood alone, faced a giant, and survived. Outro? In the end, it wasn't just swords or storms that turned the tide, it was resilience. The Mongol Empire, unstoppable across continents, was brought to a halt not by force of arms, but by an island that refused to fall. The typhoons that wrecked Kublai Khan's ambitions became more than weather. They became kamikaze, divine winds, etched into Japan's soul as a symbol of fate, protection, and identity. But behind the legend lies a real story of flawed empires, fearless defenders, and a world-changing confrontation at the edge of the sea. The Mongol invasions were more than a clash of armies. They were a clash of worlds, of strategy and spirit, of ambition and endurance. One empire reached too far. One nation stood its ground. And from the wreckage, a legend was born. One that still echoes across the waves, carried on the wind. If you enjoyed this dive into the real story behind the Mongol invasions of Japan, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss what history really looked like.